Well, hello, my name is Sean, and welcome back to the Berean Way, a channel where we strive to be as the Bereans, searching the Scriptures daily in pursuit of genuine biblical truth. And so whether you're joining us for the first time or you've been walking with us through this series, we're glad you found us and that you're here. And we don't do surface level really at the Berean Way. We dig into the Word, and we apply the testing framework, and we let Yahweh's Word say what it actually says. And so if that's the kind of content that you've been looking for and you're interested in, you found the right channel. And let me just say here real quickly before we jump in, if this content is adding some value to your walk, the single best thing that you can do to help us here at the channel to keep producing content like this is to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so that you don't miss any of our uploads. It literally takes about 5 seconds, and it makes a huge difference in getting this content in front of the people who need it. And if something we cover today connects with you, then drop it in the comments. We read those, and we love hearing where you're at in your own journey. Now, you can also find us over on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. All the links are sitting right there in the description box. So come hang out with us there. Jump into the conversation, and if you ever want to just reach out directly, shoot us an email at thebereanway1711@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Now, also, if you'd like to support us in a greater way, we do have a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box. And if you feel led to support us in such a way, just know that it's greatly appreciated. And it all makes its way right back into the content that is produced here on the channel. So let's get into what we're going to cover here today. Now, we're glad that you're here with us for this next teaching in our series of New Cart Christianity, Why We Must Test Everything. And so if you're joining us for the first time today, again, we welcome you. And I just want to encourage you to go back and watch the earlier teachings in this series before you continue here. Because in teaching 1, we established the New Cart principle from 2 Samuel 6, and we built the biblical case for why testing everything is not optional for the believer. Then in teaching 2, which we handled in 2 different parts, we constructed the 6-instrument testing framework. And those are the written word of Yahweh, the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit, the examination of the fruit, the messianic plumb line, the covenantal plumb line, and the Berean pattern of community accountability. Then in teaching 3, we applied the framework to the crumbling of biblical authority itself, examining the 4 primary mechanisms by which the modern-day church has systematically undermined the very measuring rod that it needs to test anything. And then in teaching 4, we tested the prosperity gospel and the word of faith movement against the whole counsel of Yahweh's word, and we found it to be among the most comprehensive failures of the testing framework the modern church has produced. And the playlist for all those teachings, they're linked in the description box below. And we believe that you'll get far more from today's material and teaching if you have that foundation in place, so make sure you check those out. Now today, we're going to turn our attention toward a different new cart, one that does not operate primarily in the realm of prosperity theology, but in the realm of ministry theology and church design. And it is a cart that is, I believe, harder to identify precisely because it does not usually make theologically controversial claims. Its danger, it's not found in what it says about money or healing. It's found in what it does to the very nature of the gathered assembly, the content of proclamation, and ultimately the character of the Elohim who is being presented. And this card is the seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model, and its influence on modern Christianity, it's been so vast and so pervasive and so largely unquestioned that many believers today have never really experienced any other model of church, and therefore they have no frame of reference from which to even question it. And so today we're going to provide that frame of reference, and we're going to apply the testing framework to it with the same rigor and the same commitment to the whole counsel of Yahweh's word that we've brought to every new cart in this series. Now, the Apostle Paul, writing to young pastor Timothy in what many scholars believe was probably his final letter written from a Roman prison with death on the near horizon, he issued a charge that carries the weight of a man who knew exactly what was coming. 2 Timothy 4, verse 1, Paul says, "I solemnly charge you before Elohim and Yeshua the Messiah, who is going to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom. Proclaim the message. Persist in it, whether convenient or not. Rebuke, correct, and encourage with great patience and teaching. For the time will come when they will not tolerate sound doctrine, but according to their own desires will multiply teachers for themselves because they have an itch to hear something new. They will turn away from hearing the truth and will turn aside to myths. Now, Paul doesn't describe a passive drift away from truth. He describes a deliberate, consumer-driven realignment of the entire ministry ecosystem, if you will, where congregations develop an appetite for something other than sound doctrine, and the marketplace of ministry responds by producing teachers who will satisfy that appetite. And so the people, they don't merely stop hearing truth, they actually multiply alternatives to it. They curate, if you will, a spiritual experience that is calibrated to their own desires. And Paul, seeing this coming, he charges Timothy, and really by extension, every faithful proclaimer of the word in every generation, to persist in proclamation, whether it's convenient or not. And so what Paul described in the first century, it's found its most fully developed institutional expression in the modern day seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church movement. And this is not a fringe phenomenon, friend. It is the dominant paradigm that is shaping how Western Christianity conducts its weekly gathered worship, how it designs its facilities, even trains its leaders, and measures its success, and presents Yahweh's word to the world. And its assumptions about what the church is for, who the church is for, and how the church should operate have become so deeply embedded in the evangelical landscape that to question them can even feel like questioning the faith itself. But the testing framework does not grant exemptions to the dominant paradigms of the day. The New Cart principle, it applies to the philosophically respectable and the culturally influential as surely as it applies to, the theologically bizarre that's out there today. And the questions the testing framework asks are always the same. Who authorized this? Does it really align with the whole counsel of Yahweh's word? Does it reflect the pattern that Yeshua and the apostolic witnesses established? Does it produce fruit that is consistent with the kingdom of Yahweh? Does it correspond to the covenantal testimony of the scriptures from the beginning to the very end? And those are the questions that we're going to ask today, so let's begin. Now, before we can test the seeker-sensitive and the entertainment-driven church model effectively, I believe that we need to understand it accurately. And so the testing mandate, it requires us to engage what is actually being taught and being practiced, not a caricature, and to bring the full weight of the word of Yahweh to bear on its genuine claims and commitments. So we're going to begin with an honest description of the movement by looking at the historical origins of the seeker-sensitive model. Now, the seeker-sensitive church movement as a formal philosophy of ministry, it emerged primarily in the United States in the 1970s and reached its full institutional expression in the 1980s and the 1990s through the influences of such churches as Willow Creek Community Church in South Barrington, Illinois, which was founded by a well-known minister by the name of Bill Hybels in 1975. And then you have Saddleback Church, which was in Lake Forest, California, that was founded by Rick Warren in 1980. And these congregations, they conducted surveys of unchurched people in their communities, asking them why they did not attend church and what they would find appealing if they actually did. And so the answers, it shaped the entire design of the ministry, from the architecture of the facilities to the content of the messages, even to the style of music and the dress of the staff. And so the core insight driving the movement was simply this: the traditional church, with its liturgy, its institutional structure, its doctrinal heaviness, and its cultural distance from the surrounding society, was failing to reach the unchurched. And so the solution was to totally redesign the church experience from the perspective of the person who did not yet know Yahweh. In other words, to remove the barriers that made church uncomfortable or inaccessible for seekers, and to create an environment in which they could encounter the message of Yeshua without the cultural and institutional baggage that had historically surrounded it. And so the goal was evangelism. The method was, cultural accommodation. The results in the terms of numerical growth were initially extraordinary. And so from Willow Creek and Saddleback, the philosophy is spread rapidly through such things as pastoral training networks, conferences, books, and even denominational structures. And so by the 1990s, the seeker-sensitive model, it had become the default template for church planting and church growth across most of evangelical Christianity. And today, its influence, it extends far beyond the specific congregations that originally promoted it, shaping the assumptions of pastoral ministry training programs, denominational strategies, and the experience of millions of churchgoers who have known no other model of gathered worship. But let's now turn our attention to the core commitments of this model. Now, the seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model, it rests on a collection of interconnected commitments that, when taken together, represent a comprehensive philosophy of ministry. Now, these commitments are not always stated explicitly. They're often embedded within the practices and the structures of the movement rather than informal doctrinal statements. But they can be identified and examined, and the testing framework requires that we do so. And the first commitment is this audience centricity. The conviction that the primary audience of the weekend gathering is the unchurched or nominally church visitor, and that the entire experience should be designed with that person's comfort and accessibility and engagement as the governing priority. And this shifts the fundamental question of gathered worship from asking, what does Yahweh require of his people when they assemble before him, to asking what will connect with the person who does not even yet know him. The second commitment, it's the removal of offense. The conviction that the barriers between the unchurched person and the message of Yeshua are primarily cultural and institutional, that they are created by, such things as theological jargon, liturgical unfamiliarity, institutional stuffiness, and even musical styles that feel dated and alienating, and that by removing these barriers is the essential task of effective ministry. And genuine biblical offense, the offense of the cross, of repentance, of the demands of discipleship and covenant faithfulness, it tends to be minimized or even deferred in this framework on the theory that people must first be attracted before they can be challenged. And the third commitment is entertainment value. The conviction that the quality of the production, such things as the music, the lighting, the visual presentation, even down to speaking style and the humor and the overall experience of attending, is a legitimate and important component of effective ministry. Excellence in production then becomes a spiritual value because poor production quality is understood as an unnecessary barrier between the seeker and the message. And so what begins perhaps as a legitimate concern for quality, it gradually becomes, in many expressions of this movement, indistinguishable from the entertainment industry standards of audience engagement. And then the fourth commitment is consumer orientation. The conviction that the people should be able to attend the church on their own terms, participate to whatever degree they're comfortable with, and move through, a journey or an experience at their own pace rather than being confronted with the full demands of covenant discipleship at the very outset. And so this produces a ministry philosophy in which the gathered assembly increasingly resembles a consumer experience, where the attendees' preferences and comfort and satisfaction are treated as the primary metrics of success. And this brings us to the appeal of the model and why it spread. Now, to test the seeker-sensitive model honestly, we must understand why it was so compelling and why it continues to shape so much of modern-day Christianity. Now, the movement was likely not born out of malicious intent. It likely arose from genuine pastoral concern for people who were not being reached by the institutional church of its day. And the desire to reach people who don't know Yahweh, it's not only legitimate, it's biblically mandated. The recognition that certain, cultural barriers in the institutional church were unnecessary was, in many cases accurate. The commitment to excellence in ministry, it reflects a genuine understanding that Yahweh deserves our best. And these are not entirely wrong instincts in and of themselves. The problem is not the desire to reach people, it's in the method chosen to accomplish it and what that method does over time to the nature of the gathered assembly, the content of the proclamation, and ultimately the Elohim that is being presented. And so the model spread because it worked, at least by the metrics, that most evangelical institutions use to measure success. such things as attendance, budget, facilities, and even their public profile. And so congregations that adopted it, they grew rapidly. And in a, religious culture that measures vitality primarily by such things as numerical growth, the seeker-sensitive model's results were difficult to argue with, unless, that is, you apply the testing framework and ask whether numerical growth is the standard by which Yahweh measures the faithfulness of his gathered people. Now, the first and most foundational instrument of the testing framework is the written word of Yahweh. And before we evaluate any practice or any philosophy or any system, we need to ask, what does the word of Yahweh actually say? And the first question we must bring to this seeker-sensitive model is the most foundational one. What is the gathered assembly of Yahweh's people actually for? So let's begin by looking at the assembly of Yahweh, who it's designed to serve. We're going to go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, where the text says, "And let us consider one another in order to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Now, the writer of Hebrews, he describes the purpose of the gathered assembly in language that is markedly different from the seeker-sensitive model's governing assumption. The gathering is described as being for the mutual encouragement and the provocation of those who already belong to the covenant community. In other words, believers provoking one another to love and good works, gathering together for mutual, strengthening as the day of Yahweh approaches. And the primary audience of the gathered assembly, according to this text, is not the unchurched seeker, it is the community of faith. And this is not an isolated text. This pattern is consistent across the apostolic writings, or what most call the New Testament. And so when Paul writes to the congregation at Corinth about the conduct of their gathered worship in 1 Corinthians chapters 11 through 14, his instructions are consistently directed toward the edification of the body. And so the gifts of the Holy Spirit are exercised in the gathered assembly for the edification of the body, according to 1 Corinthians 14:12. The proclamation of the word, it's for the building up, encouragement, and consolation of the community of faith and of believers, according to 1 Corinthians 14:3. And the correction and instruction that Paul calls for in such places as 2 Timothy 4:2, where he says rebuke, correct, and encourage, it's directed toward the gathered community, not toward the optimization of the experience for visitors and those who don't know Yahweh. Now, the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 14:26, Paul says, "What then is the conclusion, brothers? Whenever you come together, each person has a psalm, a teaching, a revelation, another language, or an interpretation. All things must be done for edification." And notice that phrase, all things must be done for edification. Now, the Greek word that's used here is oikodome. It simply just means the building up of the house of Yahweh, the strengthening of the body, if you will. And so this is the governing purpose of the gathered assembly according to the apostolic pattern. So the seeker-sensitive model, it tends to invert this. Rather than the gathering existing to build up the community of faith, it exists to attract and accommodate the unchurched visitor. And in the process, the community of faith is consistently fed a diet that is calibrated for spiritual infancy rather than maturity. But let's now look at Yeshua's own description of true worship coming from his own lips. We're going to go to John chapter 4, verse 23. Yeshua says, "But an hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." Yes, the Father wants such people to worship him. Elohim is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And so in his conversation here with the Samaritan woman at the well, Yeshua, he defines worship in terms that make no reference whatsoever to such things as the comfort, accessibility, or entertainment value of the worshiper's experience. He defines it in terms of two qualities, spirit and truth. In other words, true worship engages the spirit, the inner person, submitted and attentive to the Spirit of Yahweh. And true worship engages truth, the revealed reality of who Yahweh is, uncompromised by any human preference or cultural accommodation. Now, the seeker-sensitive model, by its own design, it must constantly negotiate a tension between truth and accessibility. And so when the full truth of Yahweh's word, such things as the holiness of Yahweh, the reality of sin, the exclusive claims of Yeshua, the demands of covenant discipleship and faithfulness, and the reality of judgment is presented in its fullness, it is inherently uncomfortable to the spiritually unconverted person. And so the model's solution is to defer, soften, or to simply reframe those truths to make them, more palatable to the seeker. But Yeshua doesn't offer a model of worship calibrated to the seeker's comfort level. He defines true worship as engagement with Yahweh in spirit and in truth. And he declares that the Father is seeking exactly that kind of worshiper. So this leads us to our next point, which is the proclamation of the word, comfort or conviction. Let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, part of our opening text. He says, proclaim the message, persist in it, whether convenient or not, rebuke, correct, and encourage with great patience and teaching. Now, Paul's charge here to Timothy, it describes a model of proclamation that stands in, sharp contrast to the seeker-sensitive approach. The proclamation that Paul envisions, it's not calibrated to the preference of the audience. It persists whether convenient or not. And it includes such things as rebuke and correction right alongside encouragement. And so it's exercised with great patience and teaching. The kind of sustained, rigorous engagement with the whole counsel of Yahweh's word that cannot be compressed into, some 20-minute message designed to maximize engagement and minimize any offense. The very language that Paul uses when he says, whether convenient or not, it anticipates the temptation that the seeker-sensitive model succumbs to, the temptation to shape the message, if you will, around what is convenient for the audience. And so Paul's counter-instruction here, it's not to find a more, culturally accessible way to proclaim the truth. It is to persist in the proclamation of truth, regardless of whether the cultural moment is favorable to it. And so the Berean pattern, it doesn't permit the testing framework to give this seeker-sensitive model a pass on this point because its intentions are good. The testing framework simply asks, does the practice align with the word? And here, the word, friend, it's very clear. Now, Yeshua, he declared himself in Matthew chapter 7, verses 16 through 20, that false teachers and false systems are recognized by their fruit. And so the testing mandate, therefore, it requires us to look honestly at what this seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven model has actually produced over more than 4 decades of widespread application, not merely at what it's intended to produce, but at the actual, measurable, long-term fruit of this system. So let's begin by looking at the numerical growth without any spiritual depth here, looking at the Willow Creek admission. So in 2007, Willow Creek Community Church, this is the congregation that's most associated with the development and promotion of this seeker-sensitive model, they commissioned a comprehensive internal study of the spiritual growth and formation of its own congregation. And the results were so unexpected that the church's leadership made them public in a report they titled, Reveal, Where Are You? And the findings, friend, were staggering. Despite decades of highly polished programming, excellent production quality, massive numerical growth, the study found that long-term attendance at Willow Creek was not producing the kind of deep spiritual formation and discipleship that its church leaders had just assumed it would. Now, Bill Hybels himself, who is attributed sort of as the founder of this movement, acknowledged publicly that the model had, quote, a flawed assumption, end of quote. At its core, the assumption that getting people into the seats and exposing them, to excellent programming would automatically produce mature disciples of Yeshua. Matthew 7, verse 16 says this, you'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. And this is precisely the fruit examination that the testing framework requires. Now, reaching people numerically and forming people spiritually, friend, are not the same thing. And the honest admission of even the movement's own pioneering congregation that their model had produced large numbers of attendees without producing the depth of discipleship the Word of Yahweh describes, it's a significant piece of fruit evidence that the testing framework simply cannot ignore. So let's look deeper at the fruit by focusing on the production of biblical illiteracy and doctrinal shallowness. Now, a consistent and well-documented feature of the entertainment-driven church landscape is the epidemic of biblical illiteracy among people who have attended church literally for years. Surveys conducted by those such as the Barna Group, Lifeway Research, and even the Pew Research Center have repeatedly found that church attenders in America, including those who identify as evangelicals, who consider, faith important and who attend services regularly, they demonstrate alarmingly low levels of basic biblical and theological understanding. Now, the testing framework, it asks the obvious question: what kind of teaching environment produces this result? And the answer is simply a teaching environment that is calibrated for engagement rather than actual transformation. Such things where messages are typically short, they're generally topical rather than expositional, they're structured around, life application points rather than sustained engagement with the actual text, and delivered in a context that's designed to be emotionally stimulating rather than intellectually and spiritually demanding and challenging. And so a diet of this kind that's consumed over years and decades, it does not produce people who know the Word of Yahweh. It produces people who have had repeated exposure to professionally packaged spiritual content that has not fundamentally changed their understanding of Yahweh, His Word, or His covenant demands on their life. We read in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you from serving as my priests. Since you have forgotten the law of your Elohim, I will also forget your children." Now, Yahweh's indictment here through Hosea, it was directed at a people who had wandered from His Torah, His instructions, and His law. And the parallel to a church environment that has systematically deprioritized the deep, rigorous engagement with the full Word of Yahweh in favor of accessible, consumer-friendly, spiritual content, it's not distant. It's very direct. And the fruit of biblical illiteracy in the modern evangelical church, it's not accidental. It is the predictable harvest of a model that was never designed to produce the kind of deep knowledge of Yahweh that the Word describes. And so this brings us to the consumer culture that confuses attendance with discipleship. Let's go to Matthew 28, verse 19. The text says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Now, the Great Commission, as it's often called, of Yeshua, it's very unambiguous. The mission is to make disciples. Learners, apprentices, if you will, not merely attendees or converts. And so the commission here, it involves teaching them to observe everything He commanded, a comprehensive, demanding, lifelong process of formation in the ways of Yahweh. And this is the fruit that the Word of Yahweh defines as the outcome of faithful ministry. And the seeker-sensitive model's primary metric of success, weekly attendance, it's not the metric Yeshua identifies. He doesn't say, fill the seats. What He says is make disciples. And the fruit evidence from more than 4 decades of the seeker-sensitive model, it demonstrates clearly that filling seats and making disciples, friend, are not the same thing, and that a model optimized for the former often fails to produce the latter. And so the testing framework's fruit examination finds again and again the same thing it found in the prosperity gospel: a large, visible, institutionally impressive structure built on a foundation that cannot produce what the Word of Yahweh actually requires. Now, the Messianic plumb line asks the question that's ultimately decisive for every question of ministry, practice, and philosophy. Did Yeshua do this? Did His own approach to the gathered people, to proclamation, to the communication of truth, did it reflect the principles that define the seeker-sensitive model? And the answer the Gospels provide is one of the most instructive and, for this seeker-sensitive model, the most challenging pieces of evidence in the entire testing framework. So let's begin by looking at Yeshua and the hard saying, the design that drove people away. We're going to go to John chapter 6, verse 60. The text says, when many of His disciples heard this, they said, This teaching is hard. Who can accept it? And then he says in verse 66, from that moment, many of his disciples turned back and no longer accompanied him. So Yeshua said to the 12, you don't want to go away too, do you? Now, John 6, it contains one of the most remarkable passages in all of the four Gospels from the standpoint of ministry philosophy. Yeshua, he's just delivered, what is commonly called the bread of life discourse, one of the most theologically demanding teachings in the entire New Covenant account. And the response of the crowd is not enthusiasm, it's not increased attendance, it's offense, departure, and attrition. From that moment, many of his disciples turned back and no longer accompanied him. And so the critical question that the testing framework demands that we ask is this: did Yeshua modify his message? Did he call them back and offer them, a more accessible version of his teaching? Did he dial back the theological density to retain the crowd? He didn't. He didn't adjust the content of his message to manage the departure of those who found it difficult. He allowed the truth to function as it was designed to function, as both a revelation and a separation, drawing some while repelling others. And he let the crowd go. He then turned to the 12 and asked whether they intended to leave as well. And this is the messianic plumb line held up against this seeker-sensitive model's core commitment to removing offense and retaining the audience. Yeshua didn't operate by this commitment. His proclamation was designed to be true, not to be comfortable. And the offense of the word of Yahweh is not, in the model of Yeshua, something to be managed away. It's intrinsic to the very message itself. And so this brings us to Yeshua's own methodology, the primacy of truth over the technique. Let's go to Mark chapter 1, verse 22. The text says, and they were astonished at his teaching because he was teaching them as one who had authority and not like the scribes. Now, the response of the people to Yeshua's teaching was astonishment, not because it was polished or entertaining or, produced with, excellence of presentation, but because it carried the authority of the word of Yahweh delivered with integrity and power. And the scribes, by contrast, they relied on their credentials and their traditions and the weight of, institutional authority. Yeshua, he relied simply on the word itself. Yeshua, he used illustrations, parables, and even accessible language, but his purpose was never to maximize audience comfort or minimize the demands of the message he was preaching. And so his parables were not primarily tools for engagement. They were, even by his own explicit statement, instruments of both revelation and concealment that was designed to illuminate truth for those with ears to hear and to obscure it from those who were not seeking Yahweh, according to Matthew 13. And so this is almost the precise inverse, if you will, of the seeker-sensitive model's governing assumption, which is that the content and the delivery of the message, it should be calibrated to maximize its accessibility and impact on the widest possible audience. Look at Matthew 13:11. The text says, he answered them, because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know, but it has not been given to them. For whoever has, more will be given to him, and he will have more than enough. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. For this reason I speak to them in parables, because looking they do not see, and hearing they do not listen or understand. Now, the Messianic plumb line, it does not support a ministry model whose primary design commitment is audience accessibility and offense removal. The model of Yeshua, it's a model of faithful, authoritative proclamation of truth, fully available to those who are genuinely seeking Yahweh and unapologetically demanding in its content. And this brings us to the cross as the ultimate offense, what cannot be made seeker-friendly. Look at 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18. The text says, for the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of Elohim to us who are being saved. Verse 23, but we preach Yeshua the Messiah crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Yeshua the Messiah is the power of Elohim and the wisdom of Elohim. Now, Paul's declaration here in 1 Corinthians 1, it strikes at the very heart of this seeker-sensitive model's foundational assumption. The word of the cross is, by divine design, if you will, foolishness to those who are perishing. It's a stumbling block. It's offensive, if you will. And this is not a communication failure that can be corrected, with better packaging or more engaging production or, some culturally accessible delivery style. It's intrinsic to the very message itself. And the cross is offensive because of what it declares about power and about where true power actually resides. The execution stake, the cross, if you will, it's the ultimate act of victory. The moment in which Yeshua the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim, entered fully into the domain of sin, death, and the powers of darkness and defeated them from within. He didn't sidestep death. He walked right into it and walked out on the other side as a conqueror, stripping the powers of their authority, disarming the principalities, and inaugurating the kingdom of Yahweh over all of those opposing forces. Colossians 2:15 tells us he disarmed the rulers and authority, and he disgraced them publicly. He triumphed over them in him. And so this is the message that human pride, friend, cannot tolerate and that no amount of cultural packaging can make comfortable. The world celebrates power that looks like power, such things as military strength and political authority, economic dominance and social influence. The cross, the execution stake, declares that the decisive victory over sin and death was accomplished through what the world reads as humiliation, weakness, and even defeat. That a crucified Jewish rabbi from Nazareth is the conquering king to whom every knee will bow. It's not a message that is made inoffensive, friend. It confronts every human system of power and every human assumption about how victory is achieved. It declares that the rulers of this age, both spiritual and earthly, they've already been defeated by the one who appeared to lose everything. Now, a ministry model whose core commitment is the removal of the offense and the maximization of audience comfort cannot, by definition, faithfully present this message. It has to either soften the proclamation of Yeshua's kingship or defer, the confrontation with the powers he's overcome, or present the execution stake, the cross, in such carefully managed packaging that its essential nature, its declaration of a kingdom and a king that stands in direct opposition to every competing claim of lordship, is obscured. The messianic plumb line held against this reality, it produces one of the most decisive verdicts the testing framework can render. Now, the covenantal plumb line asks whether a doctrine of practice is consistent with the whole counsel of Yahweh's word from Genesis to Revelation. And so when we bring the seeker-sensitive model under this instrument, the verdict is consistent with what we've already found. So let's look at the assembled congregation in the Hebrew Scriptures, a mikra as a pattern. We're going to go to Leviticus 23, verse 2 here, where the text says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the appointed times of Yahweh, which you are to proclaim as set-apart gatherings, my appointed times are these." Now, the Hebrew Scriptures establishes a comprehensive pattern of Yahweh's assembled congregation, the mikra in the Hebrew, the called-out gathering that runs throughout the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And what is revealing about this pattern is its consistent orientation. The assembled people gather before Yahweh, not before a program, not, before an experience, but before Yahweh himself. And so the purpose of the assembly is the encounter with the living Elohim. Through his word, through the proclamation of his mighty acts, and through the rehearsal of his covenant, through prayer, through sacrifice, and through the keeping of his appointed times. And so the gathered assembly described throughout the Hebrew Scriptures is never primarily designed for the spiritual tourist or the investigating outsider. It is the covenant community gathering before its covenant Elohim. And so the outsider, the sojourner, the stranger within the gates was welcome to observe and participate, but the assembly was not redesigned around them. The worship of Yahweh, it wasn't softened and it wasn't repackaged for accessibility. They were invited into a community whose gathering was orientated entirely toward Yahweh. And the encounter with that community gathered authentically before Yahweh was itself the invitation. So let's look at the apostolic pattern of gathered worship now. We're going to go to Acts chapter 2, verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. Then fear came over everyone, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. Verse 46, every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and break bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising Elohim and enjoying the favor of all the people. And every day Yahweh added to their numbers those who were being saved. Now, the early community described here in Acts chapter 2, it's one of the most frequently cited texts in all of Christian ministry discussion, and for good reason. It describes what the gathered assembly of Yahweh's people looks like when it's operating according to the apostolic pattern. And it includes the apostles' teaching, rigorous, sustained, authoritative proclamation of the whole counsel of Yahweh's word. And it includes fellowship, koinonia in the Greek, deep covenant community among these believers themselves. It includes the breaking of bread and the prayers, collective, corporate intercession before Yahweh. What it does not include is any evidence of an audience-calibrated production designed to make the experience accessible to unchurched visitors. It doesn't describe a community so authentically gathered around the teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers, so genuinely orientated toward Yahweh himself that the surrounding world was attracted to it. Yahweh added to their numbers those who were being saved. And so the growth was a result of authentic covenant community, not audience-centered design. And so this brings us to the prophetic warnings against these itching ears and pleasant things. Isaiah 30 verse 9 tells us, "For these are a rebellious people, lying children, children who do not want to listen to Yahweh's instructions. They say to the seers, 'Do not see,' and to the prophets, 'Do not prophesy the truth to us. Tell us flattering things. Prophesy illusions. Get out of the way. Step aside from the path,' and listen to this, 'Stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel.'" Now, Isaiah's prophetic word to rebellious Israel, it describes a pattern that is not confined to one historical moment. It is the description of a spiritual posture, if you will. It's the posture of people who know that the full truth of Yahweh's word will be uncomfortable and who therefore demand, from their religious leaders something other than the full truth. Tell us flattering things. Step aside from the path. Stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel. Those words are almost unbelievable. And the demand that Paul describes in 2 Timothy 4, verse 3, people who will not tolerate sound doctrine and who multiply teachers for themselves because, they have this itch to hear something new. It's the same demand Isaiah describes in the 8th century before the Common Era. It's not a new phenomenon in the people of Yahweh. And the covenantal testimony of Scripture, it's unanimous about how this demand is to be met, not by accommodation, but by faithful, persistent, courageous proclamation of the full truth of Yahweh's word, whether convenient or not. And so we've now tested the seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model against the written word of Yahweh, the fruit examination, the messianic plumb line, and the covenantal plumb line. And at every point, the testing framework has identified the same fundamental problem. But we've not yet really named the problem at its most foundational level. And so in this point, we're going to do that. So let's begin with the question of who worship is actually for. Let's go to Revelation 4, verse 11. The text says, "Our Yahweh and Elohim, you are worthy to receive glory and honor and power because you have created all things, and because of your will they exist and were created." Now, the foundational question that every model of gathered worship must ask is this: who's it for? Now, the book of Revelation gives the answer with unmistakable clarity. The gathered worship of heaven, which is the pattern and the goal of all earthly gathered worship, it's directed entirely toward Yahweh. The text says, "You are worthy to receive glory and honor and power." And so the object of worship is Yahweh. The gathered community exists to declare His worth and to acknowledge His sovereignty and to bow before His holiness and to receive His word with submission and awe. And the seeker-sensitive model, at its very core, it inverts this orientation. And so by designing the gathering around the comfort, the accessibility, and the preference of the unchurched visitor, It makes the person, specifically the spiritually unconverted person, the functional center of the gathered assembly. And so the experience, it's calibrated not around what Yahweh requires of those who approach Him, but around what the attending person will find comfortable, engaging, and even non-threatening. And so this is not a minor adjustment in emphasis. It is a fundamental inversion of the purpose of gathered worship. And so this brings us to when excellence becomes idolatry. Now, one of the more subtle dangers, I believe, of the entertainment-driven church model is the way in which the pursuit of production excellence can itself become, a form of idolatry. The replacing of the glory of Yahweh with the glory of human skill, creativity, and spectacle. And so this is not to say that excellence in presentation is inherently wrong. It's just simply to say that when the excellence of the production becomes the thing that people come for, when the worship gathering is primarily an experience of human artistic achievement rather than an encounter with the living Elohim, friends, something has gone profoundly wrong. Isaiah 29:13 says, "The Master said, because these people approach me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, and their worship of me consists of man-made rules learned by rote." Now, Yeshua, he quoted this passage from Isaiah in his confrontation with the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15, I believe specifically verses 8 and 9, applying it to a religious community whose worship had become a performance of, externals that did not engage the heart. And so the application to the entertainment-driven church model is pretty pointed here. When the gathering of Yahweh's people is primarily a production, a well-rehearsed and well-executed performance designed to generate a particular emotional response, the question that Isaiah's word demands is whether the hearts of those present are actually encountering Yahweh or just merely experiencing a sophisticated human production in His name. And these, friend, are not the same thing, and the testing framework cannot pretend they are. So this brings us to the missing ingredient, the very fear of Yahweh. Let's go to Acts chapter 5, verse 11. Now the text says, "Then great fear came on the whole congregation and all who heard these things." Now the reaction described here in Acts chapter 5, following the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira, is not the reaction the seeker-sensitive model is designed to produce, friend. Fear, genuine, sobering, reality arranging all before the holiness of the living Elohim. It's not on the list of emotional responses that the seeker-sensitive gathering experience is designed to generate. And yet, it is precisely the response that an authentic encounter with the living Elohim consistently produces throughout the Scriptures. From Moses before the burning bush, to Isaiah before the heavenly throne, to the disciples in the storm-tossed boat, to John on the island of Patmos. Genuine encounter with Yahweh, friend, produces holy fear. Not terror for its own sake, but the holy, humbling, reorientating awe of a created being standing before the uncreated Creator. Proverbs 1 and 7 says, "The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline." Now, a model of gathered worship that is designed to maximize the comfort of the attending person that explicitly sets out to remove the barriers and the discomforts that an authentic encounter with Yahweh produces is, by design, friend, a model that minimizes the fear of Yahweh. And so a community that does not know the fear of Yahweh does not have the beginning of knowledge according to the word of Yahweh itself. And so this is among, I believe, the most serious indictments that the testing framework can actually render. The seeker-sensitive model, in its pursuit of accessibility and audience comfort, it's literally designed out the very thing that Yahweh declares to be the beginning of wisdom. Having now thoroughly tested the seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model against the instruments of our testing framework and found it wanting at every point, the testing framework doesn't leave us without an alternative here. The same word of Yahweh that has identified the problem also provides us the pattern. And as with every new cart we've examined in this series, the solution is not to abandon the mission, it is to return to the ancient paths, the pattern that Yahweh himself prescribed. to the gathering that is designed not around human preference, but around the worship of the living Elohim and the formation of his covenant people. So let's look at the authentic community as the most compelling testimony. Let's go to John chapter 13, verse 34. He says, I give you a new command, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Now, Yeshua identifies the single most compelling testimony the gathered community of his people can give to a surrounding world: the visible, tangible, countercultural reality of genuine love among his disciples. Not some polished production, not excellent programming, not some audience-calibrated experiences, the love of the covenant community for one another. The kind of love that Yeshua demonstrated in laying down his life is what he declares will cause the world to recognize his disciples. And so this turns this seeker-sensitive model's evangelistic premise on its head. The movement assumes that the gathered assembly's primary evangelistic tool is the excellence of the experience it provides to the visiting unchurched person. But Yeshua says the primary evangelistic tool is the love of the covenant community. The most compelling thing that will draw people to investigate the claims of Yeshua is not a production, it is a people who actually love each other the way he loved them. A gathering that is orientated around the authentic formation and mutual love of covenant disciples, it will be more evangelistically effective than the most expertly produced seeker-sensitive experience, precisely because it displays what the world cannot manufacture on its own. And so this brings us to the proclamation that doesn't apologize for the word. So let's go to Romans 1, verse 16, because the text says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of Elohim for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. Now, Paul's declaration here that he's not ashamed of the gospel, it's not merely a statement of, personal courage. It is a statement about the nature of the message itself. The gospel proclamation of Yeshua, the Messiah, crucified and raised, who is the master of all creation and the only hope for the human soul, is itself the power of Elohim for salvation. Not a tool for delivering that power, and not a vehicle that needs enhancement itself. The proclamation itself, in the power of the Holy Spirit, is the power of Yahweh. And so this means that the assumption driving this seeker-sensitive model that the message requires, careful cultural packaging to be effective, it's fundamentally misaligned with Paul's understanding of how the message actually works. And so the gospel, it doesn't need, the production values of the entertainment industry to be powerful. It just needs to be proclaimed faithfully and fully in the power of the Holy Spirit. The word of the cross is the power of Elohim, not the professionally, managed presentation of the word of the cross, but the word of the cross itself. Now, the ancient paths of faithful proclamation do not require cultural apologetics. They just simply require faithfulness. And this brings us to the third point in this area and the actual final point that we want to make in this teaching, and that is the call to the ancient paths, what returning looks like. We're going to go to Jeremiah 6:16, a verse that we've covered extensively in this series and the previous one. This is what Yahweh says: Stand by the roadways and look. Ask about the ancient paths. Which is the way to what is good? Then take it and find rest for yourselves. But they protested, We won't. Now, the call of Yahweh through the prophet Jeremiah, it's the call that rings through every teaching in this series. Stand at the crossroads. Look for the ancient paths. Ask where that good way is and walk in it. What does it look like to walk in the ancient paths in the context of gathered worship? To return from the new card of this seeker-sensitive model to the pattern that Yahweh has actually prescribed. Well, it looks like gathered assemblies where the full word of Yahweh is the center, not a supporting element of some carefully designed experience, but the actual substance and goal of the gathering. It looks like proclamation that doesn't apologize for the holiness of Yahweh, the reality of sin, and the exclusive claims of Yeshua, or the demands of covenant discipleship, obedience, and faithfulness. It looks like communities that are characterized by genuine mutual love, the kind of love that makes the surrounding world ask questions that only the gospel can answer, friend. It looks like worship that is directed entirely toward Yahweh in spirit and in truth, rather than calibrated around the comfort of the celebrity pastor and the superstar worship team. It looks like a community that's willing to be small, to be countercultural, and to even be misunderstood by a world that measures success by attendance figures and production quality, because the ancient paths have never been measured by those metrics, friends, and neither has Yahweh. And the tragedy of Israel in Jeremiah's day was not that they couldn't find the ancient path. It was that they found it and said, we won't walk in it. May you and may we be a generation of Yahweh's people who give a different answer, who will say, we found the path and we will walk in it. So let's begin to wrap this up. Now, we've covered significant ground in this teaching. We've examined the origins and core commitments of this seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model, understanding it fairly and fully before testing it. We then put it to the test by applying the testing framework. The written word test found a model that has inverted the purpose of the gathered assembly. The fruit examination, it found a model that produced numerical growth without any spiritual depth, biblical illiteracy without covenant formation, and consumer-oriented attendees without committed disciples. And the Messianic plumb line, it found a model whose core commitments are contradicted by the actual practice of Yeshua himself. And the covenantal plumb line, it found a model that departs from the consistent testimony of both the Hebrew Scriptures and the apostolic pattern about what the gathered community of Yahweh's people is for and how it is to be ordered. And so the verdict of the testing framework, it's not ambiguous. The seeker-sensitive, entertainment-driven church model, it's another new card, a human-designed system, perhaps maybe built with good intentions, but ultimately constructed around the preferences and the comfort of a human audience rather than around the prescribed pattern of Yahweh for his gathered people. And just like every new cart, however impressive its construction and however enthusiastic its reception is, it cannot safely carry what it was never designed to carry. The ancient path of faithful gathered worship, centered on the full word of Yahweh, oriented toward the worship of Yahweh in spirit and in truth, and characterized by the mutual love of covenant community, and unashamed of the full proclamation of the cross of Yeshua the Messiah, it's still there, friend. It's always been there. And the invitation of Yahweh through the prophet Jeremiah remains standing. Ask for the good way. Walk in it. And so in our next teaching, we will continue to apply our testing framework to the Sabbath, Yahweh's consecrated day of rest, and the question of how the church has replaced it. So stick with us through this series. The ancient paths, they go deeper still. Now, before we finish this teaching, let's just review what we've covered very quickly here. Now, in this teaching, we've established the following. First, the seeker-sensitive and entertainment-driven church model emerged in the 70s and 80s as a response to declining cultural engagement with the institutional church. And its core commitments, such things as audience centricity, the removal of offense, entertainment value, and consumer orientation, they represent a comprehensive philosophy of ministry that has literally reshaped the landscape of Western evangelical Christianity. Second, the written word that reveals that the gathered assembly of Yahweh's people, according to the apostolic pattern, is designed primarily for the edification of the covenant community, not for the comfort and accessibility of some unchurched visitors. Now, the proclamation that Paul envisions, it persists whether convenient or not, includes rebuke and correction, and is not calibrated to the preferences of the audience. Thirdly, the fruit examination finds that over 4 decades of this seeker-sensitive model has produced attendance without deep discipleship, exposure without transformation, and consumer-oriented church culture without the covenant formation that Yeshua's Great Commission requires. And the Willow Creek Reveal study, if you will, it's among the most significant pieces of self-confessional evidence the testing framework has examined. And fourthly, the Messianic plumb line, it demonstrates that Yeshua's own ministry model contradicts the seeker-sensitive model's core commitments at every single point. He allowed truth to function as both revelation and offense. He didn't modify his message to retain the departing crowds. And the cross itself, by Yahweh's own design, is a stumbling block and foolishness to those who are perishing, a reality that no amount of cultural packaging can or should remove. And fifth, the covenantal plumb line. It finds consistent testimony throughout the Hebrew Scriptures and the apostolic writings that the gathered assembly of Yahweh's people exists to worship Yahweh, to be formed in His ways, and to be built up in the faith, not to provide a comfortable experience for the spiritually unconverted. And the most compelling evangelistic testimony of the community is not its production quality, but its visible love. And then sixthly, the seeker-sensitive model, it represents a fundamental inversion of the purpose of gathered worship, placing the human audience, if you will, at the functional center of an assembly that the Word of Yahweh consistently orients entirely toward Yahweh Himself. And so in doing so, it's designed out the very fear of Yahweh, which Yahweh describes to be the very beginning of wisdom. The ancient paths of Yahweh's prescribed pattern for the gathered assembly, friend, they're still there. The invitation still stands, and the question is, will you ask for the good way and walk in it? And so in our next teaching, we're going to stay right in this same territory, the question of what Yahweh has actually prescribed for His people. But we're going to turn our attention to one of the most, I believe, foundational and most contested questions in all of Scripture, the Sabbath. What is it? Better yet, when is it? Who's it for? And has the modern church, in its adoption of Sunday worship, or even in the Saturday Sabbatarian tradition, has it actually gotten it right? Because here's what we're going to find. The question of the Sabbath, it goes far deeper than most believers even realize. It's not simply a matter of which day of the week, we're to set aside. It's a question about Yahweh's calendar itself, about the timekeeping system that He embedded into creation from the very beginning, and whether what most of us have inherited as the Sabbath bears any genuine resemblance to what Yahweh actually established and commanded. And so teaching 6, it's going to be one of those teachings that challenge some assumptions you may have carried, friend, for years, possibly your entire life. So make sure that you've subscribed and that the bell notification is turned on, because you don't want to miss this one. And the Moedim, Yahweh's appointed times, we're going to get to those. That'll be teaching 7. But before we get there, we need to establish the foundation. And the Sabbath is that foundation. So be sure that you join us for teaching 6. And so, friends, we want to thank you for walking through this material with us today. Now, I know that for some of you, the church model that we examined in this teaching, it may be the only model you've ever known. It was, perhaps the community you were saved in, the place where you came to faith, the environment where you formed, deep relationships and experienced, moments of encounter with Yahweh. And we want to honor, the authenticity of those experiences, even as we've honestly examined the system together. Yahweh, friend, He's very gracious, and He works in and through imperfect vessels and even imperfect systems at times, because that's what He has to work with on this side of eternity. And so the testing framework, it's not a call to bitterness or cynicism about the places where we've been. It's a call to return to something much better, friend, the ancient paths of the Word of Yahweh, where the gathered people of Yahweh are formed in His image and oriented entirely toward His glory. And so if this teaching's been helpful, just share it. Pass it on to someone who has, sensed that something's missing but hasn't really had the framework to name it. Subscribe, leave us a like, turn on the notifications. Those simple actions, they help this content find the people who we believe genuinely need it, and that matters more than you might think. Now, our Buy Me a Coffee link, it's in the description box for those who feel led to support the ministry financially. Every contribution finds its way back into the channel, and it is received with gratitude, and we're very thankful. So if this teaching has raised some questions and you want to pursue it further, reach out to us at the Berean Way 1711 at gmail.com, or drop us a comment below. You can also find us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. They're all linked in the description box below, and we've highlighted in this video. And as we've already stated, in our next teaching, we will examine another major new cart, one that strikes at the very structure of Yahweh's calendar, that is, friend, the Sabbath. So make sure that you join us for part 6. But until next time, be a Berean, walk in the Berean way, and may Yahweh's shalom find you in your pursuit of biblical truth.